Hello, everyone. Today I'm with my peer coach, Sarah Hammond, who is an expert on ADHD. And yeah, so Sarah, could you introduce yourself? And I think you have a bit of a disclaimer to start with.
Yes, I was just going to say we're going to talk about a couple different things related to ADHD here today, but I was just mentioning to you that like any one of these things could be perhaps an entire podcast episode or even an entire book that has been written about the answers to certain questions. And so understanding that I'm going to just talk about it here to give people a little bit more orientation to what ADHD is, especially if you don't know that much about it. And, maybe I'll mention something that you've never heard before, so it can still be really useful. But I'm not going to be exhaustive in my answers and, haven't prepared for weeks or months to answer these questions. But definitely, I think it can be helpful for someone who doesn't know that much about ADHD. And there's a
Cool.
lot of questions about it for
Yeah.
all of us, really.
Could you briefly introduce your background and
Yeah.
what you do?
Yeah. So I have worked actually in the health profession for almost 30 years. And then in the last 10 years, I started studying coaching. I've done several different coach trainings, including an ADHD coach training. And then my son was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 5. He's now late teenage years. And in that time, like around the time he was diagnosed, I really started to research it in more depth and realized that I too probably have ADHD. And I just really started to study it a lot. And it's one of the reasons that I did the most recent coach training. You and I have both been through the life coach school. It's an amazing coach training. And all of these kinds of things. There's an expression in ADHD that pills don't teach skills. And that, has to do with that. There's a lot of, especially doctors and people that say, if you have ADHD, your best outcomes are going to be when you're on a medication. We could get more into that in a little bit. But even if you are taking medication and you're responding or it's helping you, pills don't teach skills. And so it's really helpful to learn a lot of the tools that we learn in coaching, both mindset tools and practical tools can really help with ADHD.
Cool. So, what really this is for the viewers. What really inspired this interview is that after my initial coaching training, I started coaching people online through text comments, and then one of the bigger big bigger backlashes I've gotten for my online coaching was that ADHD. I approached it in a way where, like you said, pills don't teach skills, right? So yeah, you have ADHD, symptoms of ADHD, and if you're feeling overwhelmed by a task, my approach to it was, well, your thought about the task is probably like, oh, this task is super daunting and overwhelming. So I suggested ways to think around that thought, but then a lot of comments said, oh, that has a very shallow understanding of ADHD. It's like your brain actually prevents you from doing it. And so I asked you and other coaches about, like, is ADHD, like, can you explain it in depth? And so that's sort of the context around why this interview had happened. So coming from a uneducated perspective, so
Yeah.
this question may sound very rude, but can you tell between just an undisciplined person versus a person with an actual ADHD, and does that differentiation actually matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, it does matter, and it's a great question. I think it's probably a question that is being still argued in certain circles, but ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. And so what that means is it's a disorder of our brain and brain development, and it affects in particular the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of executive functions. And so people with this is the thing that's so tricky about ADHD is, first of all, people look completely normal and they, in many ways, seem normal. In fact, they even seem bright.
Mhm.
And so it's easy to say, well, what's wrong with you? But it's like, why can't you do this thing? It's because it's like it's a disability. It's an invisible disability. And there are other invisible disabilities out there too, but it's the kind of thing that, you would say, it's as though you're saying to someone, who needs glasses, like, come on, why can't you read this thing? Or even
Mm-hmm.
pointing to someone who's in a wheelchair and saying, well, up on the first floor there's all these resources for you. Why can't you just use them? But there's only a staircase and
Mm-hmm.
there's no way for them to get up and access them. So uh, the fact that the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain that isn't developed, what that means is that something that someone else could maybe easily do, it becomes more challenging for an ADHD person to do that. And these executive functions are things like planning, prioritizing, organizing. In fact, I was kind of looking that up for a more recent definition of executive function, because there are different definitions out there. But there are like 8 different things that are part of executive function. And so, for example, someone can seem really disorganized. A great example is like going shopping to the grocery store. And so it involves a lot of things that we take for granted that are very simple, like making a list, looking and seeing, what do I need, making that list, getting yourself to the store. And it's just so often that an ADHD person comes away and forgets. There's just something they forgot. And maybe even someone asked them, oh, could you pick this up for me? And then it seems like that you just didn't care enough to remember to get that for that person, but it wasn't intentional. You didn't mean to forget it, but something, just your brain doesn't completely always fire on all cylinders.
Okay. And so you said it manifests in different ways and that it affects the prefrontal cortex. And what I've noticed from reading a lot of people's, stories about ADHD and a lot of the posts that ask for help with their ADHD symptoms is that they have a lot of shame around not being able to organize. They have a lot of shame in not being able to just do it. And
Yeah.
so when you explained ADHD to me, you said there's a lot of stigma around ADHD. So could you explain a little bit about like how that stigma and that shame kind of forms?
Yeah, I mean, it can start really early. There's so many reasons for this. I mean, one is that there's been some studies where like the average ADHD child receives, I forget what the number is. I didn't look that up, but like, 20 negative messages for every one positive message that
Mm,
they receive. And so starting even when you're a child, the whole process of being a parent is that you're correcting a child, but an ADHD child might need many more corrections. And then it's just over time, especially as you mature, you start to feel like, what's wrong with me? You even have that own internal voice of, why can't I do this? Or, or I didn't mean to do that. And then you feel a lot of regret. And there was a book that was written in the 90s called You Mean I'm Not Crazy, Stupid, or Lazy? Like,
mhm,
that was the title of the book,
mhm,
because ADHD people are often called lazy or stupid because they seem like they have trouble. And ADHD often has comorbidities, is what they
mhm,
call it, but it can be learning disabilities or slow processing, other things that make it very challenging for an ADHD person to perform. And it's additionally complicated by the fact that we can also sometimes, when it's something we're very interested in, we can hyper focus, and like everything else, all distractions fall away and we can get very focused on something and we can perform very well. But that's not really volitional. It's
mhm,
like it just is something that we happen to be interested in, and we can't force ourselves to do that.
mhm,
And so anyway, stigma develops because we often have kind of a perfectionist streak as well. We beat ourselves up, and then we receive a lot of negative feedback from just society at large, and the expectations of, and like another example being forgetful. Like,
mm,
you forget someone's birthday, and like you don't mean to, or you mean to send them a card but you didn't get it off in time, or whatever. And then people will think that you're being rude, or you're being just selfish, uncaring. And so it can come across that way. And then we feel like, oh my gosh, I didn't mean to, and you end up apologizing a lot. And so all of this, you end up beating yourself up a lot for stuff,
Mm,
and maybe getting negative feedback from authority figures, friends, parents, teachers, whatever, jobs. You could lose a job, because you weren't performing up to par, and all of that ends up building there can be a lot of negativity or a lot of judgment against yourself for that.
All right. Yeah. Um, Switching gears for a little bit, I viewed your previous interviews with other people around the topic of ADHD, and there was a lot of discussion around the specific techniques that people do to organize their day in advance, and basically practices that they do in order to work with the ADHD symptoms, right? And one of
Right.
them is like the Pomodoro technique, and
Mhm.
so from a coaching perspective, those are kind of like the A line things, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm gonna do this action without really thinking about the feelings and the thoughts. So Pomodoro techniques and other like A line things for ADHD, they probably help, but what's the limit of those practical ADHD self-help methods? Like, how far can you go with them, and like, what can you not access just by changing your actions?
Yeah, well, what I want to say is I think that's almost an individual thing, and it
Mm,
depends on so much, maybe whether a person is medicated. Like some people, if you respond to medication, and some people don't even respond to medication. But if you do and it works for you, then maybe a technique like that while you're on your medication is going to be really effective for you. But you know, that's based on this idea that you can focus for 20 minutes at a time and then take, I think it's a 5-minute break or something, and then come back. Now, at certain tasks and certain ADHD people, that might work really well for. Some people might be getting into it, and then I think you have to be careful about taking too long of a break, because switching gears or transitioning is often difficult for ADHD people.
mhm,
So even something like the Pomodoro technique, which is supposed to be helpful, you really have to try it out and see how well does it work for you, because maybe you need to adjust it, and maybe it's a longer period, 30 minutes, or maybe it is even in an hour or a 50-minute cycle, which is kind of more a neurotypical person. I think they say 45 or 50 minutes, and then that's it. You need to take a break. You can't maintain your focus after that. So people have to find what works for them. But there is, I believe, a big mindset piece, as there is for all of us. We have to look at our thoughts. They're so unconscious.
mhm,
And so we can be having, if we are having the thought, this isn't going to work for me,
mm,
or I'm not doing it right, or some other thing where you're beating yourself up, or any number of thoughts that could come in and undermine what might otherwise be a good technique. And also, the thing with ADHD is our brains are moving very quickly. As children, that is often externalized. And that's why, it's traditionally been diagnosed for little boys who couldn't sit, or even girls who couldn't sit in their seat, who are calling out in the classroom. They can't wait. They're speaking out of turn. They are disruptive, whatever. As we grow, that usually becomes more internal, and it's like a mental activity. So
mm.
you're sitting there and someone's trying to talk to you, and unless you're really, really interested in it, your mind is going in all these different directions. You're thinking about something else, or maybe there's a noise in the background, someone's tapping, and that's distracting you. And so, it just depends. I think it's important to work with both.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
yeah.
So it's a
Mhm.
very individual experience. And, we briefly touched on this with the previous questions, but so I've noticed, looking at all the ADHD posts, that there's a lot of discord around the topic of medication. So
Yeah.
some people with the ADHD symptoms, they get really offended when they say, oh, it works with medicine. And then the other part, they also get offended when they say, oh, medicine doesn't work because it works for them. So
Yeah.
why is medicine a really like a sensitive topic for people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sensitive topic, I think, for so many different reasons. Some people maybe feel like it's um I mean, some people even have guilt about taking medication, like it's giving me an unfair advantage.
Mm.
Whereas actually, if medication is working for you, first of all, you're really lucky if it's working for you. And just the process of finding the right medication in the right dose. There are these two different classes of medication, more amphetamine based and more like methylphenidate versus Ritalin. Those are two different types of amphetamines. And then there's some other kinds of classes of medication that are um, uh, not stimulant medications, but that also are helpful for some people with ADHD, which gets back to also this thing that like if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD.
Mm.
It's not a thing that like all ADHD people look the same. And so finding medication is that same kind of thing. You have to find just the right medication that's going to work with you and your ADHD. I think it's controversial also because it's given to children. That gets into a whole thing about parents medicating their children and whether or not that's okay. That's maybe even another discussion, but what I will say about that is that there are many children, if they have bad ADHD, people don't understand, they literally can't be in a classroom or a learning environment. They cannot function unless they have medication. And for most parents, it's the last thing they try. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like parents are out there just, oh, please get me a prescription for my kid. It's usually like they have tried everything else. And finally, they decide, okay, well, let's try medication and see if that's going to help. And, sometimes it makes a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's the other thing is that, people think that there's like a meme or something that medication might lead to drug use or misuse of drugs later. The fact that these medications are stimulant medications, people have a problem with the idea that you're giving someone a stimulant, especially a child. And what they don't understand is that these medications are really targeted for that prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is under functioning. And so to stimulate that part of the brain actually means that the executive functions start to come on.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone who truly has ADHD, when they're on that medication, they actually might respond by being more calm, by
Mm.
being more focused. That's why the medication works, by being
Mm-hmm.
more able to control their impulses, by
Mm-hmm.
being more able to control their mood or their emotional control. Emotional dysregulation can be part of ADHD too. It can be part of other kinds of disorders or diagnoses as well, but that there's definitely more and more in the last 10 or 20 years especially. They've kind of added this mood component as a part of it where people can be very reactive
Mm-hmm.
with ADHD. And so does that answer the question?
Yeah, so I mean, what I found really interesting is that, so basically people are just looking at the ingredient and, oh, it's stimulant. So it's just gonna hype you up. But then in
Yeah,
fact, what that's gonna do is affect the prefrontal cortex. So it actually, ironically, like has the opposite effect of making you even,
exactly. It gives you
yeah.
more control, more control.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is abuse of medication. I want to say, ironically, not among ADHD people, but
Mm.
you hear about college age students that don't have ADHD, and I've heard that this is kind of rampant. I don't really know a lot about it, but that Adderall, people will sell Adderall, and I don't know exactly how they get it, but that's a whole other thing, that people with ADHD are sometimes almost treated like drug addicts, like they just want their medication to help them so that they can focus and function better. But then it's like it's hard to get that medication approved. Sometimes doctors will even look at them like suspiciously. Like I went to get a diagnosis earlier in 2022. Now I'd been diagnosed before, but I went for another diagnosis. And at one point fairly early on, the doctor was like, why do you want medication? And
Mm-hmm.
why are you interested in medication? And I was like, I'm not interested in medication.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I don't care. I'm just wondering. I was just asking. I mean, I wanted to get the diagnosis, but I wanted to review it,
Yeah, yeah.
but and see what, because it'd been a long time since I'd
Mm-hmm.
had that. But anyway, I'm saying even I experienced that. And so there can be a lot of It's another thing that contributes to the shame, or the idea that like maybe there's something wrong with you that you're asking for
Hmm.
this medication. There's suspicion, I
Yeah.
should say. But what has been shown is that people who are medicated, there is a lot less addiction, less drug use or whatever misuse of substances when people are on an ADHD medication. One last thing I'll say about that is most ADHD people do not stick with their medication.
Mm.
And I just listened to a podcast about this recently by a doctor, and he was saying that like the average is like within like 1 or 2 months, and then ADHD people are stopping taking their medication. And what he was saying in this interview is that actually the medication is really effective, but people just stop taking it. Almost
Mhm.
like they forget to take it, or which can happen. Okay, that can happen. But I really think if the medication was really that effective, then most people would stick with it or
Mhm.
find a way to stick with it. That's my personal opinion. And
Mm.
so it raises the question for me, like, wait, how effective is this really for
Mhm.
people? Now, some people it is very effective for. I will say that. There are people who are like, oh my gosh, everything is different when I'm on my ADHD medication.
Mhm.
And that's fantastic if
Mhm.
that's your experience with it.
Yeah. So, and there is a bit of a journey to get to your individual lives, like perfect mix.
Absolutely. Yeah, I highly recommend that somebody get a proper diagnosis with someone who really knows what they're doing, and that they also work with someone on dialing in medication, and that even just the first couple of things that they try may not be right.
Mhm.
And then, you know, that they really work with someone to find the right medication and the right dose and not give up on that too early.
Mhm.
And I do think that that's possible, that that's what happens, is that people just figure, oh, well, I guess it's just not going to work for me.
Yeah. Okay. So
Mhm.
switching topics for a little bit,
Yeah.
I've been working a lot with the young adults these days, and what I've been finding is that they sort of grow up thinking that their household is kind of normal, and they had normal childhood experiences, and then they find out that, oh, there's this community called Raised by Narcissists, which is a
Mm.
community for parents with like narcissistic personality disorder. And then the group, everybody
Mm.
is finding that, oh my God, so I wasn't crazy. It was my parents who are actually having this thing. And on Instagram, there's this person called the holistic psychologist who also does like role plays for basically parents and child and different versions of like how they interact with different kinds of mental ailments. And so
Mm.
you mentioned that book called, oh, you mean I'm not crazy and I'm not lazy? So
Yeah.
that kind of diagnosis really affirms that, oh, it wasn't that I'm this bad person. It was just like me being neurodivergent. So
Yeah.
also, but I learned from your previous videos that there's a lot to be expected from motherhood, even without ADHD.
Yeah.
And there's a significant under diagnosis for ADHD in women. And so
Yes.
moms with ADHD, I think definitely will have effect on its children. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
what's something you can share about being a mother with ADHD so that the younger viewers can watch and learn and be like, have a better understanding of their parent instead of, why is my mom so crazy? Why is my mom so lazy? Why is mom so apathetic?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a great point. Well, here's the thing is, you know, as I mentioned, ADHD, I want to say it's at least like 50% heritable.
Mm.
Maybe that's even higher. I think there's another Dr. Russell Barkley has maybe even said it's 80%, but it's definitely there's a genetic kind of component there. And so if you have ADHD as a child, then it is likely that one or both of your parents had ADHD. And so yeah, I mean, ideally your parent is aware and is working on themselves and maybe can, you know, own some of their own neurodivergence. But if you're in a situation where your parent doesn't, I mean, I think it's it perhaps is asking a lot of a child to say to understand that their parent isn't doing that intentionally,
Mm.
but on the other hand, maybe if they have it themselves, then maybe they can understand that, like, they don't mean to do certain things and their parent doesn't mean to do certain things either. Um, I don't know. I personally think that it's important to have love as much as possible, in whether it's you looking at your parent or the parent towards the child, and as much compassion as possible. Now, if it's a young person who grew up in a household with ADHD and it was tremendously chaotic, then you are going to have feelings about that your parent wasn't able to be there for them in various ways. It's likely will have feelings about that, and that's something to work on both in therapy and in coaching,
Hmm.
to begin to understand and maybe see it from a different perspective, and to look at the thoughts we have about our childhood and the feelings that get created from that, and how that leads to our actions and the results that we have.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, uh, I think, first of all, it is absolutely true that many women were not diagnosed as often. And actually, there's a wonderful book called Women with Attention Deficit Disorder that was written in the mid 90s, or no, yeah, I think it was written in the mid 90s by Sari Solden, Sari. And it's about women. And part of what she says in there is that many women were missed, and that they do get diagnosed when they are trying to manage a household
Hmm.
and raising children, and maybe also a job at the same time, which has it's another reason that there's so much shame, because this feeling of like, wait, everybody else is able to do this, why can't I? Why is it so hard for me to manage all of these different things at once? um and more it is happening that if first of all, more women and young people are getting diagnosed now than they used to. But if you aren't caught early, then maybe you will be caught when you have, identified when you have a child that has ADHD, and hopefully you can get help for yourself too.
Hmm.
Um, and the more structure, which is difficult for people with ADHD, but the more structure and supports that you can put in place, the more you can help yourself. And you just have to kind of find what works for you, and it's an ongoing sort of evolving process, how to um, create a life that is more functional for
Hmm.
yourself.
Hmm. So we touched on the topic of diagnosis a few times by now. So, and you
Yeah.
wanted to reconfirm your diagnosis, and some people, don't have the intention of getting diagnosed. Some people want to get diagnosed, but
Right.
for the people who aren't diagnosed, but they just have the, symptoms and they suspect they have it, is there a significance in, getting that diagnosis? Like, how does that diagnosis affect the person?
Yeah, well, I want to say, that is a very personal thing.
Mm,
And it is interesting that some people don't want to get diagnosed. They're not interested in pursuing that at all. Sometimes they don't want their children to be diagnosed, and there can be many complex reasons for that. And some of it has to do with the stigma or shame, or thinking that that means there's something wrong with you, or that you have a mental illness. These can be some of the reasons that people don't get a diagnosis. But reasons to get a diagnosis are certainly being able to explore medication and see if that does help you. Maybe also, more and more employers, that's a whole other long discussion, whether or not you would want to tell an employer or a work situation that you have ADHD. But there can be accommodations that you can ask for, even if you don't tell them that you have ADHD. You can still just say, I work best in this way. And
mhm,
it's good to know that about yourself, sometimes even just for your own knowledge about yourself, to have a diagnosis, to be able to identify what some of those challenges are for you. I when I first looked into this, my son, basically has severe ADHD. And when I went when the reason that I went to look for diagnosis is, as I started to learn about it, I thought, wait a minute, this is me. Like, this is describing me. And I was never identified. And by that point, I was well into my late 40s, and it was probably even into my 50s before I was actually diagnosed. And so there can be a lot of sadness and regret. There can be a lot of feelings that come up when you get a diagnosis later in life. Like, it can be both a feeling of relief, like, oh my gosh, this explains so much, but also a feeling of like, oh, wow, if only I'd known. If only I'd gotten the help I needed before, or if only I could have been working on this 25 years ago, how could things have been different? There can be many complex feelings that can come up with people, and you want to just allow whatever feelings are there. Just, yeah. And then also I would say that, many people are kind of self-diagnosed. And when I first went to look at that diagnosis, they weren't sure. People weren't sure. The doctor wasn't sure. And, I actually came back a year later and had other memories of other things and that from earlier in my life. And when I mentioned these things, and finally by the end, I said, well, do you think I do now? And he's like, yes, I think you do. But then meanwhile, I've had other people say that they still don't think I do, maybe, and that I have a lot of ADHD traits. And here's what I want to say about this, is that there can be other things like anxiety, depression, that are maybe also part of your complex picture of who you are, that can contribute to how you show up. And that is the reason that, they really say you need to see a real professional, someone who can really understand these differences. And really, these are things that everybody struggles with to one degree or another. The things that the kind of the symptoms of ADHD, that characterize ADHD, everyone can struggle with them from time to time. Everyone maybe is disorganized at certain times, or when they're under a lot of stress, or maybe they're late or forgetful. And there can be a lot of reasons for that. But ADHD people, it's more like a lifelong struggle, and something that just keeps coming back up. And it's in various settings. It's not just at your job or at home, but it's really, you see it in various parts of your life. And so it can be quite pervasive, and that's a reason to get diagnosis.
Okay. All right. Now, shifting gears into a bit of a coaching related discussion. So, like what I'm primarily interested in as a coach, is that people having shame about their ADHD, which is something we talked about multiple times throughout this interview. And so but throughout the interview, I also learned that ADHD is a very individual thing, and there's a lot of variance. But if you were to cast a really wide net, if I have ADHD and I'm in the pool with my thoughts that I suck and I'm gonna be unemployable and I'm a lesser human being, like when I'm in the pool, what are some alternative thoughts to think about my ADHD that's not really shame? Again, like I understand this is a very individual thing, but if you were to cast a really wide net.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. And I want to say that's, I'm glad you asked that, because I realize, a lot of what we've talked about here today are the challenges and the ways in which ADHD can hold you back. But there are so many things about ADHD that are actually wonderful. And I want to say there's a man named Edward Hallowell. He wrote one of the first books on ADHD called Driven to Distraction. He wrote a sequel called Delivered from Distraction. And there are some other there's some other doctors that have written really great, like Russell Barkley, I mentioned, another Dr. Thomas Brown, Ari Tuckman, Sari Solden, Patricia Quinn. There's others. If you did research, there's great books out there to help you understand more about ADHD. But what I want to say is, what I loved when I first read Dr. Hallowell's book, Delivered from Distraction, he's got a page early on in that book where he kind of reframes many of the things that we struggle with ADHD in a more positive light. And so, for example, someone, you could say that they, are impulsive, but that they are also very spontaneous.
Mm.
You could say that people have trouble focusing, but they're also very creative. They think outside the box. They see things differently. I mean, actually, many entrepreneurs and very successful people, innovators in our society, are neurodivergent, and many of them have ADHD.
Mhm.
And, some of them have been really open about it, like Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin. He's kind of famously talked about his ADHD. But there's a lot of other, I think Bill Gates also has ADHD. And maybe Steve Jobs may have also, I'm not sure about him, but I think he did actually. But
Mhm.
anyway, there's so many other people and in lots of different professions, many entrepreneurs and many people who, Michael Jordan, a lot of famous people in celebrities even who've had ADHD because we have a lot of energy. We're
Mhm.
very creative. We can be very personable, very charismatic. Edward Hallowell is the one that kind of started, I'm going to call it like a movement of calling ADHD a gift. Now, this is also, again, something that's very controversial because a lot of other people, and again, someone like Dr. Barkley would say it's not a gift. It's become a professional argument about it, but hopefully good naturedly. Anyway, the idea is that some people will say it's a gift because you can hyper focus, you're very creative, you have the potential for being very successful in life. All of that is true, all of that is there. Um, and if it's not sort of well managed, now some people believe that if you take medication that it's going to somehow dampen your creativity. That is not true at all.
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, again, this is my opinion. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist, but I don't think that that's true at all. That, medication will help you to be more of who you are. It will not. And if it's doing anything other than that, then it's not the right medication for you.
Mm.
So anyway, and this idea of medicating people or children or whatever to kind of make them compliant or quiet or something, that is not what this is about. Like medication is really, it's about allowing people to function better, not about turning them into zombies or compliant, people. So anyway, thoughts that can help you are either, if you choose to believe my ADHD is a gift, or my ADHD is part of my uniqueness.
Mhm.
And you know um yeah, my ADHD is not a flaw.
Mhm.
you know um I'm just trying to think of thoughts, but like when and so when you talked about being in the pool around the shame, but it's like having these thoughts that we really need to do models on, meaning
Yeah.
look at them, question them. How does that make you feel when you think that thought, and what else is possible, but also really understanding what is being created when you are staying in that thought and thinking that thought. and
Yeah.
and first, before you can really kind of bring in a new thought, you have to really understand that it's because I'm thinking that way about myself. That's why I'm feeling this way. That's why I'm feeling shame. That's why I'm acting in these ways, maybe not showing up as well as I could and creating certain results in my life.
Mhm.
And so it's the same as with any person, even a neurotypical person,
Mhm.
that we have to really understand that it's the thought that's creating it. And yes, there's certain behaviors, but it doesn't mean you have to have a judgment about it.
Mhm.
Like, you forgot something, so you're human. You have a human brain, and can you look at that in a different way and just really look at the fact of it? Like, okay, I was 5 minutes late here,
Mhm.
or I forgot to, I forgot to send my child to school with their permission slip or whatever. That's the fact of it. And then you look at, well, like, okay, well, how can I see that differently? Like, this is part of my ADHD and I can take care of this.
Yeah.
I see it now and I can address it now.
Mhm. Okay. And now
Yeah.
continuing that line of thought, like what's the like throughout your education and training over the past 10 plus years, What's like that one T line that really impacted you personally?
It sounds very simple, but I'm just like, I can do this.
Hmm.
I can do this. And related to whatever it might be. But like that's maybe not so specific to the ADHD, but the thought behind it might be I can't do it or I'm bad, but because I I'm not worthy or something. But the thought really is like, you know, like I am worthy. We are all inherently worthy.
Hmm. Okay.
I am perfect just as I am.
All right.
I'm perfect. I'm perfectly Sarah.
And so I know that we only have governance over our own thoughts and we only take care of ourselves. Other people's problems are their own. But, you know, now wrapping up this interview, if the world could be kinder to people with ADHD in this
Mhm.
ideal world, what could the world do to be kinder?
Yeah, I mean that I think like not just with ADHD people, I think the world could be kinder. We could all be kinder
Hmm.
to it's like giving people almost like giving them the benefit of the doubt or
Hmm.
giving people a chance, uh having compassion for people, giving them a chance to step up and kind of withholding the judgment. I mean, it gets back to some of the manuals we have, the teachings that we have around manuals and
Hmm.
expectations we have of other people, and this idea that really, adults get to be adults and act how they act, and we really can have more control over what we do and how we show up. But I guess I would just say less judgment and less the world can be kinder to ADHD people by not assuming that they're doing something intentionally.
Hmm.
That they intentionally forgot to do something or that they're intentionally late or intentionally maybe disorganized or whatever. And asking them, you know, what can I do to support you? Or what do you need to perform at your best? And and even maybe challenging them. If you don't know, find that out. You
Hmm.
know, what do you need to perform at your best? What
So
environment and what supports do you need? Yeah.
literally kind of being kinder, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, um, we're I've exhausted the end of my questions, so thank you so much, Sarah. I learned a lot about ADHD, and for the viewers who are interested in getting coached by Sarah, her contact information is in the description below. And if you are interested in coaching, I definitely would recommend working with the coach like Sarah, who has the expertise in both life coaching and ADHD. Any concluding remarks, Sarah, to our
Oh,
viewers?
just this is so awesome. Thank you, Billy. What an honor to be here. And thank you for your questions. Just your questions just show your your compassion, your kindness, your interest in helping people in the world. And I hope that our discussion ends up helping somebody.
All right, I'm sure
Okay.
it will. Thank
Yeah,
you.
great. Okay. Thanks, Billy.